This is the third of three videos from Father Simon Cuff on Catholic social teaching, produced for the Formation and Learning Program at St Benet's Church, Cambridge. The first, on dignity, is also on our YouTube channel, as is the second, on the common good and solidarity. To find out more about our Formation and Learning Program, please visit our website, www.stbenetschurch.org, or send an email to the vicar.
Hello again. In this final video, I want to look at three final principles of Catholic social teaching briefly and introduce those to you. And these are the notion of subsidiarity, the notion of social or structural sin, and what's known as the preferential option for the poor. Again, we'll see that all of these principles are really outworkings of that foundational principle of focusing on the fundamental nature of human dignity and acting in such a way as we promote the dignity of all those who are created in the image of God and all those with whom we share what Christ shared with us, namely our humanity. Subsidiarity, which comes from the Latin for to provide help or assistance, first appears in Catholic social teaching in the 1930s. Pope Pius XI, writing on the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, is trying to summarise what he takes from Pope Leo's teaching in that first encyclical, a letter of Catholic social teaching. And in doing so, he introduces this notion of what he calls the subsidiary function, ordering societies in a way that different sized groups within society exist for the benefit of the individual and to support each other. And he says that societies which are flourishing should have different intermediary institutions within those societies if they are to flourish. This is often taken to be grounds for Catholic support of trade unions. And as I mentioned before, this is why it wasn't a surprise that Justin Welby attended the Trade Union Congress and asked for a new unionisation. The evidence of particularly less economically developed countries is that unionisation is an important step out of abject poverty. But it's not just a call for trade unions, it's also a call for all forms of civic and social life. So faith institutions, schools, third sector and charity organisations, groups like the Scouts, the Guides, anything where people can come together and learn how to join and flourish in society. Really, it's asking for the creation of spaces where people can practice the skills of human flourishing. And this might seem strange to us, but if we think about the way that our society has changed in the last 50, 100 years, there's really been a skewing of society, at the one hand towards the individual, and the other hand towards the big corporation and the transnational organisation. And those groups that exist in the middle, precisely the groups that Catholic social teaching has in mind when it talks about subsidiarity, have really been squeezed out. Faith groups, football clubs, political parties, anything which requires a kind of membership, a sense of belonging, has been removed. And so argues Catholic social teaching, that comes at a price. Any society which is so polarised between the individual and the large organisation, Catholic social teaching says is not flourishing in the way that a healthy society should flourish. Ernesto Cortez, a community organiser in America, says that to live in a democratic society requires these intermediary institutions to teach people the skills of participation. Where do you go if there are no intermediary institutions to learn how to talk to people that you don't agree with? How do you find out what it is to exist in a society with people that don't look or act like you? And if we think about churches, often churches are the only spaces in society or religious institutions where people who are very different backgrounds and lifestyles will come together in worship, in a Christian context, around the altar. And anything which weakens that intermediary layer between the individual and the national or the transnational stops those spaces of encounter for people that are different. And anything that stops those spaces of encounter means that we are less able to participate fully in a society and learn the skills of disagreeing well, of not polarizing debate, and all the things that we've suffered increasingly in recent years in our society. So subsidiarity is ordering our society, our church, our community, our state, in such a way as that we enable this flourishing of what are known as intermediary institutions, so that people can learn the skills to flourish. They can, for example, become leaders in church committees, church councils, trade unions, political parties, and eventually they are growing in their own confidence. They're having a stake in their community. They're learning skills which then can help them access further levels in society. So they can, for example, grow in confidence to take on positions of leadership in their church, in their community, whatever, wherever they find themselves. Pope Benedict, writing in 2009, describes subsidiarity as always designed to achieve emancipation because it fosters freedom and participation through the assumption of responsibility. There are different ways of thinking about subsidiarity. One is horizontal, that kind of ordering of society I've been talking about. The other is vertical, in that you're wanting to allow people as much control and freedom of what concerns them as possible. And so you're trying to make sure that the decisions that affect people's lives, they have a sense of investment and a stake in. The Compendium of Social Doctrine in 2004 says that the purpose of subsidiarity is to enable the creative subjectivity of the citizens, to promote the dignity of the person with concern for the family, groups, associations to which people spontaneously give life, and it makes them possible to achieve social growth. That's what we've been saying. The next principle I want to introduce us to is one of two principles which come into Catholic social teaching through liberation theology, namely the preferential option for the poor and the notion of social or structural sin. Beginning with social or structural sin, this notion of structural or social sin comes into Catholic social teaching through liberation theology. Initially, it's contested by the hierarchy of the Church, who disagree with the liberation theologians that you can assign responsibility for sin in a structure. The Catholic Church, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, are very hesitant to assign sin to a structure because they think that if you assign sin to a structure, it absolves individuals of moral responsibility. So whilst the liberation theologians in South America are saying that sin is so oppressive in cultures where poverty is endemic, that it's almost as if it rises out of individuals and creates an environment which causes further sinning. The hierarchy of the Church initially said no, sin doesn't do that. Sin is always the result of individual actions. Increasingly, over the course of the 20th century, the notion of social sin was adopted within Catholic social teaching, taking the insight from liberation theology that sometimes sin can grow out of individual actions to the point where it upholds and sustains and creates a system in which sin is so oppressive you can't help but sin, almost like original sin. So on the one hand, the sense that these oppressive, sinful, unjust structures, which cause injustice and promote injustice and keep people living in situations of poverty and injustice, but it also included that notion of individual responsibility, and saying that whilst there are such things as structures of sin or social sin, sin is always the result of individual actions. So any of us have a choice to either maintain a system which is sinful or to take a stand against it. If we maintain it and if we act in accordance with the social sin that's around us, we are responsible for furthering that evil. If we take a stand against it, we are responsible for taking a stand against that evil. And so rather than simply say structures of sin and therefore people who participate in these sinful systems because the system is above them are not culpable, Catholic social teaching says all of us have to look at whether or not we are promoting or taking a prophetic stand against a particular unjust situation or system. A second notion which came into Catholic social teaching through liberation theology is the notion of the preferential option for the poor. The famous liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez said that the translation of the preferential option for the poor from Spanish into English loses lots of the force of the Spanish, which is something like compulsory obligation to prioritize the poor. That it's not an option; it's an obligation on the Christian. Initially, this principle arrives in liberation theology through an observation that religious brothers and sisters, lay workers, and clergy who had very, very limited resources available to them in South America were prioritizing the poor, because where they had no money to put any resources, they had to put the resources where they were most needed. So they prioritized the poor just because they didn't have enough to go around. Increasingly, it became that experience taught them that this was also a theological truth. That again and again we hear on the pages of Scripture that God prioritizes the poor. We see in the Acts Council that Paul is reminded to provide for the poor. We hear in Our Lady's song, the Magnificat, that God is raising up the poor. We hear in the Beatitudes again and again and again. We know that God enters into situations of poverty and transforms them, and calls us as Christians to do the same. One of the criticisms of this principle, particularly as in how it exists in liberation theology, is that it somehow suggests that God prefers the poor over the rich and shows favoritism towards the poor. In reality, this principle is a challenge to those of us who have wealth to ask what we're doing with it. If we see ourselves as wealthy and we cry foul of God's favoritism towards the poor, we're challenged to ask ourselves, well, at what price is our wealth? How are we sitting here in comfort and luxury when there are those next door, like the poor man at the gate, who lack something? Are we using the things that God has given us in the way that He intends? More fundamentally, the notion of the preferential option for the poor is a reminder that by focusing not just on alleviating poverty through charity, but overcoming the systems and processes that lead to poverty through the search for justice, that by prioritizing our energies on ending the systems of poverty, ending, for example, the causes of homelessness, not just housing homeless people or feeding homeless people, we will build a society which more easily acts in accordance with human dignity. That by focusing on the processes of poverty making and marginalisation, we serve the common good, because those processes which lead to abject poverty and lead to abject marginalisation exist at every level of society. And so by focusing on those processes, we build a society, a context, a community which better serves the common good, which better serves the dignity of each of the human beings in that society. And so these three principles, subsidiarity, social sin, preferential option for the poor, are all about how do we organise ourselves as a human family in order to promote the human dignity. And again, just to leave you with some questions on those principles, the key question for a church or a community promoting subsidiarity. How are decisions made in our community? How do we encourage the participation of each and every person? Thinking about the structures of sin. To what do we give our support? What are the unintended consequences of our assumptions and what we take for granted, and who is impacted by them? And a question for a Christian community wanting to promote the option for the poor: how do we support those in poverty beyond mere charity? How do we respond to God's challenge to us through those who are marginalised by our current ways of living?